Welcome. Good afternoon. My name is Joseph Capizzi. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon for what should be a really interesting and important conversation about COVID and vaccinations. Obviously, we're working on nearly a year of trying to survive during a pandemic, the likes of which we've not seen in decades. It's posed many challenges for all of us. We now face a situation where there have been multiple vaccines that have been approved for human use. And today we've gathered a really wonderful panel of scholars, all of whom are faculty at the Catholic University of America. So we're deeply pleased that they could join us. The Institute for Human Ecology, of which I am a part, is focused on the conditions of human flourishing. What we try to do is study those conditions, in particular from a Catholic perspective, though we believe those conditions are the sorts of conditions that apply to all human beings. We do this by bringing together scholars across many disciplines. Today, we're bringing scholars who come to us from political philosophy, from moral philosophy, and from moral theology. So let me introduce my colleagues to you. Like I said, we really do have a wonderful panel here, and I think their expertise is unparalleled. First, Brad Lewis is an associate professor in the School of Philosophy at the Catholic University of America. He specializes in political and legal philosophy. He also serves as associate editor of the American Journal of Jurisprudence and is working on a book about the idea of the common good in Catholic political thought. Second, Melissa Muskela is an associate professor of philosophy at the Catholic University of America. Her teaching and research focus on natural law, biomedical ethics, and the moral and political status of the family. Her book, To Whom Do Children Belong? Parental Rights, Civic Education, and Children's Autonomy, was published in 2016 by Cambridge University Press. Finally, Paul Scherz, also from CUA, is an associate professor of moral theology and ethics in the School of Theology and Religious Studies. His research and teaching draws on his dual training in genetics and theology to focus on the ethics of science, technology, and medicine. He is the author of Science and Christian Ethics and co-editor with Joseph E. Davis of The Evening of Life, The Challenges of Aging and Dying Well. So how we'll proceed is I'll just ask questions to my colleagues. We'll have a conversation for about 40 minutes, and then we will open up our conversation to you listeners. My hope is that you will ask your questions to us by using the Q&A box. If you desire to be identified, I'll read your name. Otherwise, please do specify that you prefer not to be identified when I'm reading the questions to my colleagues. And we'll do that for about 20 minutes or so. So we should have good time for a real conversation about an issue that, of course, is really intimate to all of us, really very quite personal. So let's just dive right in. Melissa, I'm going to throw the first question at you, but really I would like to hear from all three of you. Why are there ethical concerns about this vaccination? Just if you can give us a sense of what's animating these questions.
So Joe, many people who are deeply committed to the dignity of human life from conception to natural death, as I am and as we all are here, are worried that these vaccines are morally problematic because they have a connection to a past abortion. And the nature of that connection is that so far, all of the vaccines that have been approved or are likely to be approved in the near future are either developed, produced, and or tested using a cell line called HEK 293, which was originally derived, or at least thought to be originally derived, from the kidney tissue of an aborted fetus in the early 1970s. So the fact that there's a past injustice that we are benefiting from, and that these vaccines are in some indirect way a fruit of that past grave injustice of abortion, is what leads many people to worry about the moral permissibility of taking the vaccine.
Great, thank you, Melissa. Paul, what do you think? Do you agree? Is that what, I mean, is that more or less the case, that this is really about a connection of the development of these vaccines, and I guess all of these vaccines in some way, to the HEK 293 line?
Yeah, I would agree with Melissa that that's the primary ethical concern coming out of the Catholic community about these. But I would say there are also a number of other issues that people are concerned about. So the scientific research was amazing here. I mean, at no other point in history have we gotten a vaccine for a disease so quickly. But that raises questions in many people's minds that need to be addressed, and which the scientific community have addressed, about things like safety. What are these doing? So there's both the ethical issues, but then there are a number of other issues about how do we engage people well to discuss about the strengths of these vaccines, the safety of these vaccines, and how do we ensure that they're distributed fairly.
Okay, great. Let me ask you both a question. Melissa, your response suggested that perhaps there might be a distinction drawn between a couple of these vaccines with regard to their relationship to the HEK line. Is that the case? Is there some both scientific distinction between the way the HEK line was involved with the development of a couple of these vaccines, and is there then a moral distinction between a couple of these vaccines?
Yes, there is a scientific distinction. It's debatable whether that scientific distinction has any real moral significance. I would say that it does not. So the scientific distinction is that the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines are mRNA vaccines. This is a new vaccine technology. So with this technology, you don't need to kind of grow a attenuated version of, or kind of mimic of, the virus in a cell line in order to produce the vaccine. With the mRNA technology, therefore, you don't need a cell line for development and production of the vaccine. And so HEK 293 was not used to develop or produce, as far as I'm aware, the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. It was, however, used for confirmatory lab testing of the vaccine. So it wasn't used as extensively as it was in, say, the AstraZeneca vaccine, which is probably the one that's most likely to be approved next. That vaccine is more of a traditional vaccine using more traditional technology. And so that did use HEK 293 also for development and production. So that means it's using more of it. However, because this is an immortal cell line, using more of it, it seems to me, doesn't really matter, because using more of it doesn't increase the connection to abortion, which is in the past, and doesn't perpetuate or create any demand for future abortions or more fetal tissue, again, because the cell line is immortal. So using more of it doesn't really make any difference. It reproduces itself easily and definitely. And so that doesn't really increase the morally significant connection to the past injustice of abortion.
Okay, excellent. So from your perspective, given the way you just completed that, there really is no moral distinction here to draw between these two. Okay, and Paul, are you more or less on the same page with that, or would you maybe disagree?
I would slightly disagree. I mean, I think all of these vaccines, they can be, and we'll be getting into this, I think they can all be used with a clear conscience. But when we decide, when we try to determine how closely our actions are related to an immoral action that occurred previously, a long tradition of Catholic casuistry has said we should pay attention to how distant we are causally from the action. And the fact that the AstraZeneca vaccine and the J&J and Janssen vaccines, another one that's about to be approved, it's the production of, that they are involved in the actual production of the attenuated virus, of the virus. And that for the Moderna and Pfizer ones, they were just confirmatory tests that occur. It would suggest that the Moderna and Pfizer ones are further distanced from that evil action. It's one step further away. And this is the analysis that the bishops have used in looking at these different vaccines, saying they are all you can use them in moral conscience, but one is more troubling than the other two.
Okay. So both of you then are talking to some extent about the category of cooperation with evil, right? I mean, that's what we're discussing. So the category of cooperation with evil is an old and esteemed category, right, in moral, philosophical, and theological analysis. I think we probably all agree with that, and none of us would find that controversial to say that. But at its base, it presupposes that in some way you are cooperating with evil, right? And the evil, as Melissa described, is the abortion that is at the basis of the HEK 293 line, right? There's an evil that occurred in the past, and that always has to be the case in a cooperation with evil. We're talking about some evil that occurred in, at some moment prior to your own activity. And now, Paul, as you sort of just suggested, the question is how proximate, or in what way, and we use the language of proximity and distance, which just open up other philosophical questions. But in what way is my action now related to this evil action, right? And so proximity suggests things like time, right? It's temporally in some way distant, and it even suggests almost like a spatial quality to it, that in some way, in terms of maybe category or something, it's distinct from this other thing. If you don't mind my asking to both of you, walk us through this just a little bit more tightly. So here I am, I'm somebody who's concerned about being back, about catching this virus. It's a scary virus, right? It's not equally scary to all of us, right? I think all 3 or 4 of us are not in the high risk category. So far as I know, I don't know your health histories, but I'm just presuming things. We're relatively younger. But nonetheless, we don't want to be part of the sort of vectors that transmit the disease. We want to help slow down the transmission of it so we can return to a functioning economy and so on, open up our university well. But I am concerned because we share a concern that that a life was taken, an innocent life was taken, and in some way my action is, if I become vaccinated, is connecting itself to the death, right, of that human being. And it's easy to sort of abstract that and think abstractly, right, about that relationship. Give us the mechanics of cooperation with evil that allows us to feel comfortable. As you said, Paul, my conscience is clear, or our conscience can be clear. Just give us a little bit of the mechanics of cooperation with evil, how you'd spell out, this is why we should be clear conscience about this, aside from the fact, well, the bishop said so, which helps too, right? Do you mind, Paul, just taking a swing at that a little bit?
Yeah, the category with cooperation of evil is this principle, that a category that allows us to deal with the fact that we live in a sinful world where whenever we're acting, we are acting in concert with others. The results of our actions are contributing to what others might do, and we are benefiting or being harmed by the actions of others, right? So the evil actions of others. So the mechanics of cooperation with evil, it deals with situations, and I think about this a lot in healthcare, of, say, people working a hospital, where secular hospital, where perhaps operations like sterilization occur, which would be illicit according to Catholic teaching. But there are many people at the hospital who are helping the hospital keep going. There's the receptionists, the janitors, the engineers, there's nurses who are taking care of patients before and after the operation. So in some ways, they're all contributing to that problematic action, right? So the things that cooperation of evil has done, it's created a couple of different categories. So first, the action that you're doing, not the evil action, the action that you're doing that's contributing to it. So getting the vaccine, it cannot in and of itself be an evil action, right? So getting a vaccine is a good action. So that would, you can't be intending supporting abortion, right, in this case, or supporting the problematic, the sinful action, which would be formal cooperation. Now, okay, so you don't support the the sinful action, the action you're doing is not sinful in itself. That's called material cooperation. And generally, when we're discerning about material cooperation, there are a couple of considerations. There's the consideration of what you call proximity, right? How close are you to the problematic action? So in the case of the hospital, I would say the nurse is much closer than the engineer who's keeping the hospital, the power running, or the janitor, right? So you have to make those considerations of proximity. For, in the case of the vaccine, the person doing the research, the person who developed the cell line is much closer to the action than the person who is receiving the vaccine. But there's also considerations of what good would be foregone by stepping back and not doing whatever action you're going to do, which would be cooperation. So a janitor who said, I'm just not going to work in that hospital, he would be losing his job, but also not contributing to all the other good things that are occurring at the hospital.
Yeah.
In the case of the vaccines, the good that is at risk here is the public health, the common good, one's own personal health, right? So these are all things that weigh in the side to say that the person who's receiving the vaccine is distant in time. This happened 50 years ago. There were many steps of the person deriving the cell line, the person creating the vaccine, and between them and the actual evil action. And the good is significant enough to make this cooperation distant enough from the evil action to make it allowable.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. So it does seem like we're all agreeing that the way to approach this is the issue of cooperation with evil, and it seems like we all agree that.
Could I just step in on that?
Yeah, please, Melissa. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, that's okay. I agree mostly with what Paul said, although I think that if you want to be sort of technical about it, and there are some debates about this among moral theologians and moral philosophers, something like the use of the cell line HEC 293, strictly speaking, doesn't fit quite well in the category of cooperation, because cooperation suggests that you're actually cooperating with, in other words, facilitating in some way, an evil that is happening or about to happen. But when you're talking about an evil that happened 50 years ago, of course, nothing that I do now can change the fact that it happened or make it more likely that it happened, right? Because it's a past evil. So some have suggested that a more helpful way to talk about this, although the underlying considerations are really the same, but that a more helpful way to talk about it is to talk about appropriating the fruits of evil or benefiting from past evil. And the considerations are going to be kind of parallel to the considerations for cooperation. So in appropriating that evil, say in using this cell line for research or in taking the vaccine, are you in any way approving of ratifying the past evil, saying, well, yeah, actually, it's kind of good that abortion happened because now we get this vaccine, right? That would make it wrong because your will is now also approving of the evil. It's in line with the kind of original evil will. And then there are also going to be considerations about, for instance, are you in any way perpetuating this evil, sort of creating a market for it? So, and this I think is an important difference, maybe we'll talk more about this later, between the use of cell lines like HEK 293, which are immortal, and the direct use of human embryos for research, or the direct use of fetal tissue for research. Both of those cases, using them creates demand for more. And so even though the evil of creating and destroying the embryo, or the evil of the abortion to get the fetal tissue were in the past, if you're using that fresh tissue and it's not unlike the cell line, it doesn't reproduce itself indefinitely. You're creating demand for more. So you're kind of feeding into a system, you're creating a market, right? So it's kind of like buying products, made with slave labor. You may, you don't have anything to do with it, but if you buy the product, you're creating the market and the demand for it. And so you're incentivizing the injustice. So that would be a problem. And that, I think, is the crucial difference between using these cell lines and these other forms of research that use kind of fresh fetal tissue or human embryos, which I do think we should be very strongly against. So that's a consideration. And then there are considerations about the effect on your character. And I think that ultimately, in terms of the categories of, say, material cooperation and proximity to the evil, even with the category of cooperation, what's really going on there is the concern about the effect that this is going to have on you as an agent. So is it the case that, because I work in this hospital that gets some of its revenue from sterilizations or abortions or other immoral procedures, and so I'm benefiting from the hospital's prosperity, and part of that prosperity might be coming from these immoral procedures. Am I then kind of inclined to let the evil intentions seep into my own will and actually, not be as committed to stopping those evils as I might otherwise be, because I'm getting desensitized to it or I'm benefiting from it and don't really want it to stop, even though in theory I recognize that it's wrong. So there are these kind of dangers of the corruption of character that can happen when you are routinely benefiting from an evil. And I think that's where the closeness can be more dangerous, right? The closer you are to the evil, I think the easier it is for these dangers of corruption of character to come in, and the more difficult it will be to kind of distance yourself in terms of your will from the evil action. And that seems to me as really the key factor.
Yeah, really great stuff. Brad, I want to make sure that you don't want to jump in here, because I know, even though you're more of like an expert on common good type questions, moral obligations, perhaps, and so on, if there's anything that comes up that you feel you want to weigh in on at this point, don't hesitate to join the conversation. Okay.
Yeah, I'm not. I don't have the scientific knowledge that other people do, but the point that Dr. Muskela just made about the possibility of encouraging a kind of ongoing market or ongoing situation, I mean, that's something that is a kind of part of the common good and part of our moral culture, and so I think for that reason it has a dimension that goes even beyond the immediate ethical question. So
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Yeah, Melissa, so going back to you raised a distinction that I think is important, and I've seen some confusion about this in the Catholic press or social media world, and that is the distinction you made between the use of an immortal cell line and the use of fetal tissue, embryos, and so on. You made the distinction, and then you began to sort of touch on a kind of moral distinction between the two. There is something to be said, right, that an immortal cell line is a different thing, right, than is fetal tissue and the use of embryos which are destroyed for research and so on, right? Can you just give us a little bit more about that?
Sure. Yeah, I agree that that's a really important distinction. And I think often that's part of what I take to be the confusion, well-intentioned, but I think confusion of many pro-life groups whose work, I very much appreciate and respect, but some of them I think have come out mistakenly against taking the vaccine because they're confusing the use of HEK 293 and similar cell lines with the moral problems involved in direct use of aborted fetal tissue or human embryos. So the direct use of aborted fetal tissue or human embryos, it would be, say, basically you're getting the tissue directly, from the abortion provider, say, and using it directly in your lab to perform, some kind of experiment, some kind of testing on that tissue, and then that's that, right? The tissue has been used in the experiment, and if you want to continue to do more, you need to get more tissue. And the similar thing would happen with, some kinds of research on human embryos. Whereas when you're dealing with a cell line, so the cell line was derived from tissue that, yes, the tissue came from an aborted fetus, so you have kind of fresh tissue coming from an aborted fetus, but then the researcher, in order to derive the cell line, modifies that tissue to make it reproduce itself indefinitely. And I think this is something that, maybe, and I'm not a scientist, so maybe Paul can speak more to this, but I think we sometimes fail to appreciate how, in a way, strange it is that we have these cell lines that reproduce themselves indefinitely. This is not a natural phenomenon, if you will, right? In nature, when something dies, it disintegrates. Cells don't continue to reproduce themselves indefinitely. So, and it was actually a great advance in modern science and research when we finally produced the first immortal cell line. Scientists were working on this for a long time. It was very hard to do it. And so when these cell lines are produced, the original tissue from which they're produced is biologically modified and then cultured in a certain way that makes it possible for it to reproduce indefinitely. So what you're dealing with here is something that is biologically very different from, sure, it contains maybe some DNA fragments from the original aborted fetus and so on, but biologically it's not the same as the direct tissue of the aborted fetus. So when sometimes, pro-life groups are saying, you're taking a vaccine that has aborted fetal tissue in it or something like that. Well, that's just false. So there's even a biological distance in the kind of identity of this cell line by comparison with the use of fresh fetal tissue, which just is the tissue of the fetus.
Great. Paul, do you want to follow up on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think Melissa has made a number of really important points. Yes, these cell lines have been highly modified. They've introduced a number of different mutations and changes that have gone on over the many, many years in which they've been passed in the lab. I think there is, and I think the distinguishing this from things like fetal tissue research, which is ongoing, and the pro-life group has done a number of important steps against it in the last few years, and the ES cell controversies, embryonic stem cell controversies, and that we're taking ongoing embryos from IVF and deriving stem cell lines. This is in the early 2000s. This is very different from that, because this is not something where these kinds of cell lines are going to continue to be derived. You're very great distance. The question of what these cell lines are is something that is difficult, and how to think about that has challenged a lot of people. We see this with Henrietta Lacks, the HeLa cell line,
right,
which many people are perhaps familiar with. The other concern that I want to raise here is whenever you're talking about cooperation, you also generally think about scandal or appropriation. You think about scandal, right? Could people be confused that we're involved, because we're involved, Catholics are taking this vaccine, that they support abortion or something like that? Because so few people know the actual source of these cells, when I was in science for many years, I never used these lines, but I knew about them, read papers. I had no idea that they were derived from an abortion until I came into moral theology. But also I would say that the fact that Catholic organizations have spoken out so forcefully over the course of the vaccine developments, arguing that we should have vaccines weren't derived from problematic tissues, these kinds of things. I think that speaks against the possibility of this causing scandal. So that would be the other concern people might have.
Okay, so I want to be respectful of time, and I want to switch in a second to the sort of political or communal questions. But let me press you both on the cooperation question. And the cell line issue. We've reverted a couple of times to the fact that the cell line HEK is about 50 years old, and in a way, what that does is it suggests a kind of, well, it happened way back in the past, right? a little bit like Nazi research, right? Nazi medical research, right? It happened, and then we have these issues about cooperation or appropriation of that, but it was a past event. What seems different to me, and I think perhaps also to some other Catholics who are concerned about abortion, right, is abortion's still happening, right? And why is it morally relevant that an abortion happened 50 years ago from which a cell line, was developed that is now immortal, as opposed to 2 weeks ago? I mean, if there was another immortal cell line that was, we developed from an abortion that happened 2 weeks ago, would we say, well, that's permissible for us to use research based on that abortion? So what is the moral force of the fact that's happened 50 years ago? Or is my question confused?
I think that's a really good question, and I think you're right that a lot of people would push back in a similar way. And
right.
The fact that abortion is still ongoing is one thing that makes this case trickier in some ways than cases about, say, using Nazi research, the information that we've derived from Nazi research practices, right? Which people are concerned about, but people routinely do it, and we recognize that you can use that information without ratifying the past injustice or or any of those issues of moral corruption to character that I was mentioning earlier, and without scandal, right? Without in any way implying to outsiders that you approve of those past research practices. I think that the same still goes for the use of these cell lines in a way, regardless of how long ago they were made. But I think that if they were made longer ago, first of all, the case for using the cell lines grows, right? So one of the things that Paul mentioned when he talked about the framework for cooperation was there has to be a kind of analysis of proportionality. In other words, is it worth, even the slight connection to the evil that using these cell lines involves? Is it worth that because of the benefit that can be achieved, right? And in the case of a brand new cell line, the arguments are often going to be no, or less so. So that what's interesting about these cell lines is that there's actually a way in which the more you use them, the less incentive there is to create a new one. Because the more you use it, the better known it becomes among researchers. And for a researcher, you want to use a cell line whose properties are well known, that you want to use something that other researchers can easily replicate because it's widely available. So the fact that HEK 293 is after the HeLa cell line, which Paul also mentioned, is in basic science research the second most widely used cell line. So that particular line has a value for researchers, which is very important. And so some people say, well, can't we just throw all that out and start a new cell line? Well, that's kind of like saying, well, can't we just throw out all the data that we got from the Nazi research, pretend it doesn't exist, and try to derive it again? You would lose a lot of very important benefits there. And again, because you're not perpetuating the injustice of abortion by doing this, using the cell line isn't actually contributing to making any more abortions happen than if you didn't use it. So I think those are important considerations, and you'd have to make that same kind of calculus, or that same kind of analysis when you're thinking about using a cell line that was derived 2 weeks ago. You just have to go through the same steps, right? Is using this ratifying the evil in any way? Is it perpetuating the evil in any way? Is it likely to kind of corrupt my character and make me to think of the evil as evil? And is there a good enough reason to use this cell line rather than some other one that doesn't have these problematic origins? And if there is, then it might be okay use it. But if it turns out that, these cell lines are being made every day, then you get into the problem of perpetuation and creating a market. So I think those are the kinds of considerations.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. So Brad, okay, you're up. Is there a moral obligation to take one of these vaccines? I believe, right, Pope Francis was on record as saying this, at least in response to journalist question. And I think today we read that both Pope Francis and Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI received the vaccines. Is there a moral obligation to get vaccinated?
Yeah, I think there is for some people. I think it wouldn't be an absolute moral obligation, and it wouldn't be a universal moral obligation. The way that we, I think, usually think about moral obligation is that it's an act that a person, there's a kind of rational necessity that a person either perform that act, or in the case of a negative obligation, not perform it.
Right.
That's justified by the common good in a large sense. But moral obligations are not mostly absolute obligations. There are a few that are, and they're mostly negative. And also, they have a force that varies. If you're thinking about a moral obligation simply, so some fall more weightily than others, and even for specific persons. I mean, there are role-specific obligations and obligations that are more general. So it seems to me you certainly could make a case that there's a moral obligation to take the vaccine, certainly for some people. Obvious case of a person for whom that wouldn't be an obligation is a person who's, because of their own medical history, there's a good chance that they could have a negative reaction to it or something like that. And people with certain sorts of allergies are in that position. And the obligation could be correspondingly weightier for people who are healthy, but who work, for example, in certain contexts, a person who works at a long-term care facility, or healthcare workers, people who are in very regular contact with other people, that there would be a correspondingly weightier obligation, it seems to me. Yeah.
Great. And could you see a situation where it would be justifiable for there to be like a state mandate that its citizens become vaccinated, or would that be state overreach?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think, the basic answer to that, I think, is probably no, for this reason. I mean, any kind of coercion requires a justification, right? There's a prima facie sense that a normal adult human person, deliberate choices, I mean, in a way that's right. What it means to be a person. And so it's an important good that human beings have, that they can make free, deliberate choices, and to restrict that or take it away is therefore a serious thing that requires justification. And there's another kind of distinction that goes along with that, which is, I think, typically we think of there being a kind of moral difference between a coercive requirement that's negative and one that's positive. So prohibiting a person from doing something they want to do versus mandating that someone do something that they don't want to do. And I think we tend to think of the latter case as more serious, morally more serious. And that's what this would fall under, right? I mean, an intervention in a person's body, a medical intervention, a positive thing that does in fact affect a person's bodily integrity. And it seems to me that the bar for mandating that sort of an act is pretty high. And now I'm not a lawyer, but I think sort of at the national level, it's hard for me to see how that could be justified. I just don't think our Constitution would allow for that. Perhaps at the state level, the residuum of police power that states enjoy might make it a possibility. Although I think there are aspects of the Bill of Rights that would lead that to be litigated,
Right.
So I think it's more likely that where people were sort of required to be vaccinated, it would be as a condition of something else they were doing, right? That they're working in a certain industry, or they're working in a certain government position, or perhaps the children who are in public schools or teachers in public schools. because there you've got a kind of private, a personal choice that's been made, and as a condition of doing that, it may be that you could require, just as we require vaccination for public school children and so forth. But I think a kind of, certainly a national and probably even a state mandate that says everybody has to get vaccinated or something, it seems to me that the bar for that kind of thing is just too high.
Right. And following up on the conditionality, right? Would that be similar also to like you've seen floated the notion that airlines might require vaccinations and so on, right? I mean, that there would be, again, a kind of conditional, I've agreed now to fly, and therefore I must consent as I do to other, things that airlines require of me, like not bringing arms onto the plane or whatever, right? So you could see as plausible and perhaps as permissible airlines making these kinds of judgments, although I guess you could still have arguments about the law, and whether they're public goods or something. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, I think that's right. And the same would go for even private employers. I mean, there was just a story in the Washington Post this morning, I think, but the Dollar General store chain, I think, has said that they're going to require their employees to be vaccinated if they want to continue to work there. And I think there are probably a lot of businesses, a lot of enterprises, even whole industries that are probably going to go that route. But something like airline travel could well be the same thing.
Oh, great. I see that we already have questions in the box. So I am going to start going through these questions. Please, like I said, write your questions to us. We're looking forward to them. If you'd like me to read your name, I will. Our first question is anonymous, but other than that, I'm happy to, identify you and thank you for joining our conversation. So this one is especially a question for Dr. Scherz. The person writes, the more traditional and perhaps more troubling vaccine, that is the AstraZeneca vaccine, is also much easier to distribute and much more tried and true. And this person writes, and question mark, safer perhaps. So it's a much more traditional vaccination approach than the mRNA approach. Do you have any concerns first about the mRNA approach, Paul? Obviously this is drawing on your scientific background, and then I think Paul, Melissa, and Brad as well. How does the fact that the AstraZeneca vaccination, and I think the J&J one too, how does it being more traditional perhaps lead us into considering it morally perhaps a good way to go because it's presumably safer and so on?
So I don't really have any concerns about the safety of the mRNA vaccine. Operation Warp Speed cut down on some of the bureaucratic requirements for doing clinical trials, but it did not cut down on any of the kind of safety requirements. So we have pretty good safety data on these vaccines, right? I mean, they went through clinical trials. Each of them had about 30,000 to 40,000 people involved, and they were shown to be safe. Pretty much, kind of most people, the side effects that most people were kind of very mild, like redness, swelling at the injection site, fatigue, things you would get, say, with the shingles vaccine that millions of Americans get every year. There have been a couple of more serious reactions, but that's something that happens with all vaccines. So this is about 11 people in a million have had more severe allergic reactions, but those have all can be taken care of very easily with things like EpiPens, things like that. So I'm not concerned about the safety of them. Some people have asked the question, well, this is a new thing, it's involving mRNA. Does that change your DNA at all? And I think it's important to note that generally, just to review a little bit of the biology, the instructions for making proteins are in DNA. DNA is turned into mRNA, and mRNA then goes on to make the protein, is used to make the protein. Information does not generally go back the other way, aside from very few things like HIV virus. So there's very little chance that the mRNA vaccines will have any effect to cause mutations, things like that. I mean, I can't imagine a mechanism. So I don't think there are, and already about 10 million people have been vaccinated in the US with these vaccines, and their vaccine side effects usually show up pretty quickly, and we haven't seen anything else.
So I'm going to put you on the spot. So you go to get vaccinated and they're like, which would you like, the AstraZeneca or the Moderna, Pfizer? You're indifferent.
Oh no, I would say actually the Moderna Pfizer ones, I would say that they've actually been shown, or it's more likely to be more effective. The efficacy of the AstraZeneca, people say it's more traditional, but actually this is a new kind of vaccine as well. There haven't been any of these kind of viral vaccines either. So that's just as experimental.
Okay.
I would say I would prefer probably the mRNA vaccines, but I think most people won't have a chance. Right. So in that case, I think it's fine to get either of them. But
so clearly you're not worried. The point is you're clearly not worried about the mRNA any more than the other. Okay.
No.
Excellent. Great. Thank you. Okay. The next question, also anonymous. The panel has mentioned that there are other ethical concerns with the vaccine and its development beside the aborted fetal tissue question. How would you suggest that groups such as pregnant women or women of childbearing age, this is a great question, right? This class in particular, pregnant women, women of childbearing age who do not have as much information as other groups do on how the vaccine would affect them, how should they approach this stuff? I've noticed this myself. There's been very little information that's sort of specified how these vaccines bear on women in this situation the questioner is describing. Do you have information about this, Melissa or Paul? What should women in that category do? You want to go first, Melissa?
I haven't looked into this in great detail. There have been some reports on places, reported on in places like LifeSite News and so on, which are often not the most careful about the way that they put things, indicating that there could be some scientists have given some concerns about the mRNA vaccines negatively affecting fertility. When I looked into that, it seems that there was no credibility to those statements at all, and I see Paul is agreeing with that. So I think we have no reason to believe that these vaccines would be any more harmful to women's fertility or to pregnant women than basically any other sort of vaccine. Obviously, pregnancy, I think, is a special category where, people might want to have special care, but of course, getting COVID while you're pregnant could also be a concern. So I think the concerns could weigh on both sides of that for a pregnant woman. And I don't see any credible data indicating that there is any concern about risks to women's fertility of taking any of the vaccines.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, there was a concern that the protein used in the vaccine, that the vaccine is causing a reaction to, is similar to a protein in the placenta, but actually there are many other proteins in the body that are much more similar, and so you would have tremendous health effects if this was actually a concern. And we know that there have been, I think, something like 23 women who received the vaccine in the clinical trial who became pregnant. And it would also be a problem for just the natural immunity to COVID from people who've gotten it. And we know that lots of women have become pregnant after having COVID. So that's not a worry.
Okay, great. This question seems to dovetail off of, Brad, some things that you already said. And the questioner is asking, is it ethical to force a person to receive a vaccine or any moral medical treatment against their will? But let's just keep this on vaccine, right? Is it ethical to force a person to receive the vaccine against their will? And more or less relatedly, right? Another question that was asked earlier was whether somebody couldn't, as a kind of symbol of their opposition to abortion, say, look, in essence, I understand other people are going to get vaccinated, but I will not, out of a kind of expression of the evil associated with abortion, I refuse to do so. Brad, what do you think of first, sort of the forcing a person to receive a vaccine against their will, and then about the judgment someone might make about sort of symbolically expressing opposition to abortion by refusing to receive the vaccine?
Yeah, I mean, in general, as I've indicated before, I think to use kind of legal compulsion to vaccinate people, I think is wrong. I wouldn't think that was something that you should do. Ordinarily, any kind of medical intervention on a person that's done without their consent, I mean, it can constitute assault under certain circumstances. So, I mean, unless you're talking about a person whose ability to consent is compromised in some way, in which case there are provisions for that. Usually we think that requires consent, and I think that would be true of a vaccination as well. There might be some small category of exceptions. I mean, think about people who are incarcerated. You might make a case, I mean, that the virus has hit the penal system kind of hard, and under the circumstances, there might be a case to be made that it should be mandatory under those circumstances, at least given, if you don't think there's a possibility that it'll injure the person, if their medical history has been taken into consideration and so forth. But ordinarily, I would think that you shouldn't use compulsion. I don't think it could be justified. And some people would say, well, but some of these other things you've said, working for a company or flying an airplane or whatever, that's pretty close to compulsion. And I suppose it is, but it's still the case that a person ultimately can decide whether they're going to do those things or not. And I think that's important. The symbolic objection, I mean, I understand the sentiment there. It seems to me that there are far better and more productive ways that one can manifest one's opposition to abortion than this. I mean, far more direct and likely to be efficacious than something like this, which doesn't seem to be apt to make the point or to persuade other people to take the pro-life position more seriously. It seems to me that it's likely to do the opposite.
Great, thank you. All right, so does remote material cooperation with evil, Melissa, we'll start with you on this one. Does remote material cooperation with evil require a person to also express their disapproval with that evil? And if it does, if you're required to express that disapproval, what advice would you give to Catholics receiving the vaccine?
So I think the requirement that you express your disapproval is aimed at the concern about scandal. So the point is that, if it's likely that your participation, so, to go back to Paul's original example, which is an actual example of cooperation with evil, the engineer working, building engineer for the hospital that provides abortions or sterilizations, that person is contributing to the enterprise that is doing these immoral things. Does that person need to publicly manifest their opposition to the fact that the hospital performs abortions and sterilizations? I would say in a case like that, probably not, because no reasonable person would take the fact that they're the building engineer for this hospital to imply an approval of the hospital's policy regarding abortion. So I think to the extent that it's necessary to avoid scandal, you have to make your disagreement known. But if there is no real risk of scandal, then I don't think that is essential.
Thank you. Okay, this is a question from David Morton. And David Morton writes that some bishops are discouraging Catholics from taking the vaccination due to the link to the aborted fetus, due to the link to HEK. Is this morally questionable? In other words, in the same way that the state shouldn't force its citizens to take it. All right, so I think we've all seen this, right, on social media and elsewhere, right? Some bishops, I mean, I'm aware of at least one, I don't know how many more there are beyond that, but right, at least one bishop, perhaps a couple others, have discouraged Catholics from receiving the vaccination on the argument that it is an illicit cooperation with evil. It seems like we all disagree with that bishop's judgment, right? Paul, you want to start? Like, Right. That judgment is presumably based on some faulty reasoning, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Catholic moral theology as a tradition and as embodied in a lot of the moral reasoning and as the magisterium has developed it, says that no, you should get vaccinated. You have not maybe a strong moral obligation, but there is a kind of strong consideration for the public, for the common good, to get that vaccination. That you are distant enough that this does not cause scandal in that way, and that you should consider the vaccination strongly and seriously given your conditions. Yeah, but you should not just you should not avoid it for these symbolic reasons.
Okay, thank you. Melissa, this next question seems like it's responsive to your raising the questions about character formation or deformation, even as a consequence of cooperation to evil. So I'm going to ask this one to you. Why isn't the threat to character that you discussed earlier just baked into receiving a vaccine derived from aborted fetal cell tissue, even if the cell tissue line was derived long ago? The questioner writes, I'm just going to skip a little bit. I'm struggling with the fact that all who receive the vaccine derive a personal benefit from the vaccine and hence benefit from a remote moral evil. So why isn't that corrupting you, I guess, is what this person is arguing, no matter how remote it is, because it's a serious moral evil nonetheless. How would you address that, Melissa?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think the idea of corruption of character being baked into some action is a kind of category mistake, because you can't, your character can't be corrupted from the outside or sort of by accident, right? Your character is formed by your free choices, by your acts of will. So your physical proximity to some moral evil or to some past injustice can never force your interior act of will to ratify that injustice or approve of that injustice, which is really the concern about character. So, I mean, think about a quasi-analogous situation. Imagine that a baby is murdered, say by her abusive father, and then that the mother, who was not an accessory to the murder, consents to allow the baby's heart to be used for transplantation to save another baby's life. So if you're the parents of the baby whose life could be saved by taking this heart, now obviously the baby was murdered. That's a terrible evil. If you accept that heart for transplant, you are benefiting from that terrible evil, right? Your child is being saved as a result of that terrible evil. But does that mean that if you accept that heart for a transplant, you're ratifying the murder, or that your character is going to be corrupted, and that you're necessarily going to say, well, I'm glad that that murder occurred because that saved my baby's life? That could be a temptation, I agree, for the parents whose child is saved by that. But I think, just as with many other things, they can easily rebut that suggestion if it comes into their head and say, well, no, of course, that murder was horrible. I feel terrible for the parents whose, for this mother whose baby was killed by the abusive father. I wish that had never happened. I would have preferred to get a heart from a baby that died of natural causes, even though, of course, I wouldn't want that to happen either. But now here it is, right? I can't change the fact that this baby was murdered, and the mother has consented and actually sees that there's some meaning and good that can come out of this as a result of, her baby's death saving some other baby's life. I don't think that there would be anything wrong with that. One simply has to make the interior effort to distance oneself from the evil. The same thing would happen, say, with, benefiting from Nazi research, which we do all the time. Or cooperating with evil in, through what we buy and sell, which we do all the time, right? Tons of companies, hundreds of companies give to Planned Parenthood directly or indirectly. You know, every time I buy Nike shoes or Energizer batteries, you know, some small portion of that is going to Planned Parenthood. Does that mean that my character is being corrupted by that, or that I absolutely must never buy from those companies? I just don't think, I think the answer to that is obviously no.
Great. Paul, do you want to say anything about that, or you cool with Melissa's response? Melissa, that was great stuff. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that I think her analysis was exactly right. I mean, I think this comes down to a more basic issue, as I said at the beginning, that we live in a world that's complex, interconnected, and we do our best to step away from evil actions. But if you're in the world, you have to make these kinds of careful judgments of what is too close, where do I step back? And what kind of where exactly do I have to make conscientious objections? And this is not one of those cases where you would be close enough that it would make sense.
Okay, so we're at 3, but we've got some great questions. Do you guys mind 15 more minutes of responding to questions at least? You know, I mean, I just want to thank everybody. These questions are phenomenal, and I mean, you can just see there's so much more for us to discuss here than we're going to be able to. We're just touching on some issues, but I find this a very profitable conversation. Okay, Paul and Melissa, the next question writes, and this is a great question too. Can you return to the point regarding how bad the use of the cell line was in the development of the vaccine? Melissa gave equal weight to production and testing, while Paul said that the use of the cell line only in testing made those vaccines less bad. Okay, you remember that, guys? You both seem to, you know, have a difference of opinion about the relationship of the cell lines to production and testing. This question is asking that. I'd be interested to flesh out the principles to help with your analysis. Okay, so if you could, perhaps we'll start with you, Paul. Why you distinguish those things, Melissa? Why you think you know, there's not really a moral distinction between them?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a very technical difference Melissa and I are having. I mean, I think I would say that I use, sometimes when you speak about these things, you use kind of common language, right? So really what you're talking about is how remote is something. And the more remote something is from the evil action, the more acceptable it is, right? So the AstraZeneca vaccine, the cell line is actually being used in the production of the virus. The mRNA vaccines, they're not being used in the production of the actual vaccine. So they were just used in some confirmatory steps. So it has the cell line actually had very little to do with the actual ongoing production of this vaccine. So when you're getting to distance, it's much more remote causal from the one than the other. But as a practical difference, you know, if you have to walk in and get the AstraZeneca because that's what the pharmacy has that you go to, then it doesn't really make a difference.
So if I understand real quickly before Melissa goes in, so the mRNA vaccine, for instance, does not at all require HEK 293 for its being. For its being used by me does, because that's the means by which it was tested, right? But its being is unrelated entirely to HEK 293, whereas the other vaccine, the AstraZeneca one, for instance, that at its level of being, right, does depend upon HEK 293. Is that right? Okay.
Right.
Okay. Melissa.
Yeah, I recognize what Paul is saying here, but it seems to me that what's going on, as I said, essentially, when we're analyzing how remote we are from the evil, is really what matters is how remote is our will from the evil, how great is the danger that even if we are not directly approving of that past evil, we might come to be less firm in our opposition of it because of the kind of constant exposure to benefit from the past evil. So I think, if some people might worry, well, if you're, say, a researcher and you're developing and producing this vaccine and you're kind of constantly using HEK 293, perhaps there's a slightly greater danger of these kind of character corruption concerns, where you could become desensitized to the past evil that made this cell line possible and so on. But I mean, I think that danger, I mean, it's kind of like adding a millimeter to 1,000 feet or something like that. I mean, it's so slight in terms of the possible differences that it seems to me that it's a kind of distinction without a difference in terms of moral significance. And again, and I think the heart transplanted from the murdered baby is a helpful example here, where it doesn't get any more proximate than that. But the point is that it can be okay because it can be done without any extremely serious risk of corrupting your character or ratifying the evil or giving scandal that by taking the heart you're approving of that murder. So I think the point is that physical proximity doesn't always map onto the kind of proximity that matters from a moral perspective.
Yeah, look, this is great stuff, and you can see that we could have a panel entirely devoted to talking through the will, intentionality, physical proximity, and so on. And I think there would probably be some disagreement among the three or four of us for sure. But nonetheless, we all seem to come down on the use of the moral use of this vaccine. So I'm going to go to a question by somebody named David Cloutier. For any of the panelists, he asks, does conscientious objection to this make sense on Catholic grounds? And if so, do Catholic employers have challenges? So Brad, why don't we start with you on that one? Does conscientious objection to this make sense on Catholic grounds?
I've listened to what Paul and Melissa have said, and from other things that I've read, I don't feel that way myself. I agree with what we've all heard today. But certainly there are people who have conscientious objections. And again, my position is that I don't think it can be compelled. And so under the circumstances, if there are people who, as a matter of conscience, are convinced that it's the wrong thing to do, then, that's a matter of conscience. And I don't think people should be compelled for that reason. I might disagree with their reasoning, but there it is.
I agree with what Brad says, though I would, of course, add that we have an obligation to inform and educate our conscience. So if it turns out that there is no good reason for the conscientious objection, then I think that it could be, in a sense, in bad faith to continue to go forward with it, especially considering the very, very grave concerns for the common good that tell in favor of taking the vaccine, right? It's not just a matter of preserving physical life and health of those who are at serious risk of death or grave illness from COVID-19, but it's also a matter of all of the other, untold evils that have resulted from shutting down society, loss of education, mental health crises, loss of meaningful work for so many people, loss of meaningful social interaction that is just so important for the flourishing of the human person, and the fact that really the only way to get anywhere close to back to normal is to get herd immunity, which means that those who don't have a medical reason for not taking the vaccine, really do ought to consider seriously a duty to take it for the sake of the common good, because herd immunity requires at least about 80% of people to be vaccinated or otherwise immune to the disease.
Yeah, I agree absolutely with all that. And I just would say one other thing, so there's the question of the vaccine and whatever worries that people have of it, but then all the other inconveniences that have come from the pandemic, more than inconveniences. I mean, really terrible burdens that people have had to put up with, and you weigh that against the, taking the vaccine and so forth. Even one wouldn't ordinarily want to do it, and even if you just think about the number of people who've died and the mortality rate compared to the number of actual infections is very small. I mean, as a kind of percentage, but it's a very large number of people.
Right.
And I think if we were in any other circumstance where somebody said, look, something could happen in which 370,000 people could die, what measures would we not take to prevent such a thing? It seems to me we'd go very far to try to prevent a thing like that happening. And that's just an indication, I think, of how serious the stakes are in this, and trying to get to the point where we have a population immunity that would put all of this in the past.
Look, I absolutely agree. These are great points. In fact, they cover a question John Martino was going to ask about the public health need for lots of people to get vaccinated. And I think you both have spoken beautifully to this. And I know as well, Melissa, you've talked about this. Colleagues of ours have talked about this. To your point, Brad, the virus has really exposed the way as a culture we think about classes of people, right? The elderly, for instance, right? Or people in the single state, right? People who live by themselves, right? Have been really, vulnerable to the burden you described, right? Bearing this burden, both in terms of their lives, especially with the elderly, and then to loneliness and, alienation and so on that is associated with being on your own. I happen to be fortunate in having a large family. I experienced the virus very differently from other people, but it's really exposed a lot of issues that we all care about, right? We care about as faculty and so on, that really need addressing. So I think to John's question, you guys have really sort of covered. There is a public good here that would be pursued by people getting vaccinated, right? And that's why it's important for us to discuss the moral question, and I think hopefully to more or less put it to bed, right? That we all agree these vaccines are acceptable. It's unfortunate that that they're tied in some way to abortion, which we all condemn, right? But nonetheless, the world is broken, as we've all described, and there is a great good that we're trying to pursue by getting vaccinated. Now, all that said, this is a great final question from Cynthia Roberson for us to consider, and I guess I'll start with you, Paul, since you've got the deepest science background of any of us. She writes, to prevent the future demand of aborted fetal cells for the development of vaccines, what could we do as Catholics to prevent this demand when we cooperating in taking such vaccines that use fetal cell lines? This is a really important question, and I'm glad she raised it. Often what happens is Catholics talk about, well, we have to seek and provoke the development of alternatives, when we because we are cooperating with evil, and even though it's a remote cooperation, not remote material cooperation is justifiable, but nonetheless it is an evil. But part of what happens in the interim is we don't do anything about it, right? And we find ourselves often back in the situation where here we go again, right? Where we're just going to rely on this research, the development, and so on, and find ourselves, justifying it in the name of circumstances and so on. So what as Catholics can we do to prevent the demand that Cynthia Roberson writes about, to use in any way, things that are connected to an evil, to a grave evil, right? The taking of innocent life. Paul, you want to start with that?
Sure, and I think we saw different Catholic institutions in this country doing a great job at the beginning of this of the pandemic, arguing that we should try to have vaccines made from not from these kinds of cell lines. And there are a number of the vaccines that are being made that were in development that weren't connected to them. And even the Moderna and Pfizer ones are very distantly connected to it, right? So I think there was a great witness by the Catholic community doing this. I think where the pro-life movement has been putting its focus on fetal tissue research, right? You only can address so many issues at once. And I think the fetal tissue research has been something that they are focusing on in appropriately, right? And these other kinds of emerging things, which are connected to ongoing collections of tissues and abortions, things like that. So I think those are the kinds of ongoing ways that the Catholic community can do this, and which we see it doing, is so looking out for new developments that are problematic and also lobbying about research and research funding.
Melissa?
I want to again sort of just highlight the important distinction, because I think the question recognizes the distinction, but then quasi conflates them between the use of cell lines like HEK 293 and the use of direct use of new fetal tissue. So these vaccines are made with the cell lines, and again, using the cell lines does not create a market for more abortions, does not create a market even for more cell lines. In fact, on the contrary, using the established cell lines means that we don't need new ones. And makes it less likely that you want to use new ones, because you want to use the established ones for scientific purposes, generally speaking. So I think that when we're trying to figure out what is it that we need to protest, I don't actually think that we need to protest the continued use of a cell line like HEK 293. I think what we need to protest is the creation of new cell lines from aborted fetal tissue, or the direct use of new fetal tissue or embryonic stem cells in research. That's where you get the question of perpetuating the injustice, creating a demand for more tissue, and therefore more abortions or more creation and destruction of human embryos. And I think that there are alternatives to that, right? You can get fetal tissue for research in morally permissible ways. It could be possible to get the fetal tissue that would be necessary for research from non-viable preterm births or spontaneous miscarriages. What you'd have to do is kind of have some institutional setup with hospitals where there's a sort of protocol for getting the consent and using the proper procedures so that tissue from natural miscarriages or non-viable preterm births could be used. We just don't have those protocols set up. So I think lobbying to get those protocols set up, instead of going with the established pathways of getting this tissue from abortion providers, which is what's now the current practice, I think that's where we need to kind of focus our energies, and also to focus our energies on emphasizing or encouraging the use of alternatives to embryonic stem cells, like induced pluripotent stem cells or umbilical cord cells, again, all of which can be obtained ethically. So I think that's where we want to put our efforts in order to avoid perpetuating these kinds of injustices.
Excellent. Brad, any final words?
Yeah, on that, I mean, I just think the most direct thing is the evil involved is the evil of abortion, and also the creation of embryos to be used in scientific research where that happens. And so to eliminate the evil is to eliminate those things. I mean, that's it seems to be where the effort needs to be.
Yeah, just to add to that quickly is, I mean, one of the most practical way of doing that is, of course, funding, right? Cutting off federal grant funding for research that uses tissue from aborted fetuses, or that involves the creation and destruction of embryos. And that's been done in the past. I mean, it was done, by the Bush administration in terms of the embryonic stem cells. It's was done, recently by HHS to stop funding for the use of new fetal tissue. Unfortunately, it's very clear that the current administration will reverse that. But I think those are the kinds of things that we want to push for, right? Cutting off funding and things like that are usually the most practical ways to change the way that research is done.
Great. Super. Thank you guys for joining us today. Melissa, Paul, Brad, this was really fantastic. I think there's a lot more, again, that we could discuss, and even perhaps a lot that's really quite technical about, action and so on, that probably we'd all love to at some point spend some time discussing. Thanks to all of you who joined us this afternoon. I hope you profited from our conversation. There's clearly, much more to be said about all of this, but I think you did hear from us a kind of uniform agreement that we ought to get vaccinated if we are not compromised in any way by the vaccines. We ought to get vaccinated. It is going to help us get out of a terrible situation, really, one that I think Melissa and Brad described very well at the end. Thanks on behalf of the Institute for Human Ecology. Thanks to my staff who helped put this together. We are an institute that's committed to the anti-abortion position. We believe abortion is wrong. We're trying to articulate, again, the grounds of human flourishing that stem from our tradition, but are not, the sole possession of our tradition. And I hope you saw that from our panelists today. Have a good afternoon, everyone. God bless.